Oh, I love this story. The Israelites are in the wilderness, newly freed from being slaves. They've been traveling from place to place under God's command. Now, they've seen spectacular miracles, pillars of cloud and fire. They've seen manna rain down from the heavens and quail appear to ease their hunger. Anybody ever eaten quail?
Yeah.
It's very good, very tasty actually. But now they're camped in the wilderness. Their water has run out, and probably many of them are dehydrated. As thirst develops into panic and panic into fury, the Israelites confront their leader, and by extension, their God. They ask Moses, "Why did you bring us out of Egypt just so we could die of thirst? Give us some water to drink." Now, reading these Exodus stories, it's sometimes easy to get a little irritated with the Israelites. We want to call them a bunch of whiners and complainers and tell them to put their big girl and big boy pants on. Good grief, God's led you out of slavery and taken you to a new land, and yet they still complain. And of course, when I look back on it, if I was moving from place to place every night, I'd probably do some complaining too at some point. I wasn't sure if I was going to get water to drink. Out in the wilderness, there is no water. And people start complaining to Moses. They always like to complain. And Moses, of course, gets irritated. Now, I would think that Moses might just get that God might just get a little irritated also. After all, God has led them out of slavery. But God is a lot more patient than I am, and he tells Moses, "Go out in front of the people and take with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile, and go. I will stand before you by the rock. Strike the rock, and water will come." Moses obeys, and miracles follow. Fresh water begins to flow. I imagine there was a mad rush towards the gushing water as people satisfied their thirst. In these recent weeks, with the hurricanes, with the earthquake, there's been a shortage of water, and we have seen the lines of folks waiting for water and just basic essentials. Can you imagine what it must have been like if God had just allowed water to flow for some of our hurricane victims? And perhaps God did, we just didn't see it. I imagine that once the water started to flow, Moses thought, "Oh, thank goodness. Escape this one, dodge another bullet." I imagine to have a crowd of people that are very thirsty and complaining, and even though you're the one who led them out of slavery to freedom, the crowd's immediate needs seems to have forgotten all that as they complained to Moses, their leader. So I want to talk just a little bit about complaining. Research shows that most people complain once a minute during a typical conversation. Now, complaining is very tempting to us because sometimes it feels good to complain. But like many other things that are enjoyable, complaining is not good for you.
That's right.
Now, your brain loves efficiency, and it doesn't like to work any harder than it has to. So when you repeat a behavior, such as complaining, your neurons branch out to each other to ease the flow of information. Remember neurons in school? This makes it much easier to repeat that behavior in the future. So easy, in fact, that you might not even realize that you're doing it. So when you complain, your neurons start to grow closer together, and the connections between them become more permanent. Scientists like to describe this process as neurons that fire together, wire together. So repeated complaining rewires your brain to make future complaining more likely. Over time, you find it's a lot easier to be negative than to be positive, regardless of what's happening around you. Complaining becomes your default behavior, which changes how people perceive you. And here's the real kicker. Complaining damages other areas of your brain as well. And I'm not making this stuff up. Research from Stanford University has shown that complaining shrinks the hippocampus. I think that's how you say it. An area of the brain that's critical to problem solving and intelligent thought. So if you damage your hippocampus, that can be real scary, especially when you consider that it's one of the primary brain areas destroyed by Alzheimer's. When you complain, your body releases the stress hormone cortisol. I'm sure we've all heard of cortisol. It's why we're heavy. I blame mine. I got too much cortisol. Cortisol shifts you into fight or flight mode, directing oxygen, blood, and energy away from everything with the systems that are essential to immediate survival. So one effect of cortisol is to raise your blood pressure and your blood sugar so that you'll be prepared to either escape or defend yourself. All that extra cortisol released by frequent complaining impairs your immune system and makes you more susceptible to high cholesterol, diabetes, heart disease, and obesity. It even makes our brain more susceptible to strokes. Now, since we're mostly social beings as humans, our brains naturally and consciously mimic the moods of those around us, particularly people we spend a great deal of time with. You ever been around somebody and suddenly you start picking up some of their behavior, yes, positive or negative? You'll be in a really good mood and then you go to, complaining Courtney, and within an hour you're in a really icky mood, you're kind of angry and you're not sure why. This process is called neuronal mirroring, and it's the basis for our ability to feel compassion for others. But the flip side is that it makes complaining a lot like smoking. You don't have to do it yourself to suffer the ill effects. So if you're around people that complain a lot, they're going to want you to join in their pity party so they can feel better about themselves. So think about it. If you were sitting there next to a chain smoker, would you sit there all afternoon inhaling secondhand smoke? Because they say that's just as dangerous, if not more, than actual smoking itself. So sitting or hanging out with somebody continually that always complains sets you up for the bad effects of complaining. This has been one of those weeks in which it's just been, have you ever had one of those weeks where it just, you wish it wasn't there? No. It accumulated with, besides making a trip to Bosque Farms to pick up a granddaughter who told me she was in Bosque Farms, and really she was 10 minutes from my house on Camino del Bosque. Note to self, do not trust directions given to you by granddaughter. I was in the car 2.5 hours in the rain, and I was just not a happy camper. But on Thursday, my Wednesday night, at like 11 o'clock, my kitchen sink starts overflowing, and I mean overflowing, to where me and I are there scooping up, we had pails, scooping up the water and throwing it out the door. And it took them a day to get everything fixed and all. But I didn't complain because I kept thinking, I'm not in Puerto Rico. They have no water, where they're begging for help, where they need just the essentials. And I couldn't complain. It just stopped up, things happen. It's just a part of life. Instead, I began to give gratitude for having a place to live and having water that runs, even if it's running up out of the drain instead of As the Israelites were complaining, they kept asking the question, is God with us or not? Even after all that they had experienced, all the miracles, the separating of the Nile River, they still ask, is God really with us or not? Maybe those ancient Israelites feared that they were truly all alone. Maybe leaving Egypt, that which was known, had been a mistake. Maybe they had misread all of God's signs and now God had abandoned them out in the wilderness. Now, at stake was not the existence of God, but God's presence in the details of their lives. Is God with us here in the desert? Is God among us when we thirst? Is God still for us?
Yeah.
Before God provided that much needed water, God tells Moses, I will be there with you. I will stand there. The people really didn't need water as much as they needed the assurance of God's abiding presence. I wonder if God was there by the rocks as the water flowed out and people were just so busy getting water they didn't notice. Was God there physically? We don't know. Perhaps the true miracle in the story wasn't God's intervention, but God's restraint. Did anyone look for God or give God thanks for the water that was flowing? Scripture tells us that God was standing there. God in the cleft between the rock and the water. Too often, we blame God for the places or circumstances we find ourselves.
Amen.
Forgetting that perhaps the God who gives us water may also give us wilderness at times.
Oh, yeah.
After all, God was leading the Israelites in the wilderness. It took them 40 years to get from Egypt to the Promised Land. And if you look at a map, they could have taken a nice little direct route. It would have taken 40 years. Instead, they're all over the map, just all over the place. I believe God was teaching people at that time.
Yes.
I have often found that those places of wilderness can be a very sacred place. And the circumstances that point to God's absence are often the ones that reveal God's presence most richly.
Amen.
When you feel as if God is not there, if you will be still, give it time, you can and will experience the presence of God. So we ask, is God truly among us or not? Foolishly, we ask this question as if its answer should come to us once and for all, so that if God could just prove God's existence, we'd never have to ask for reassurance again. Perhaps God could show up here one Sunday morning, something that we could see with our eyes, hear with our ears, maybe even touch. God could even interrupt our PowerPoint presentation and give us a personal message on a Sunday morning. And yet God does not do that. Because I think that if God did show up so that we could see God, or jumped in our car tomorrow as we're driving into work, when things got rough, we would still ask, God, are you here or not?
Amen.
What the Israelites yearned for, what we really yearn for, is not a God out there in the cosmos, somewhere out there, wherever out there is. We want a God that's right here in the messy particulars of our lives. So we ask again and again because we need to know again and again, is God among us today, and now, and now, and now, and tomorrow, and the next day? In my marriage that is failing, in a diagnosis that I'm afraid of, in my shrinking paycheck, in someone's untimely death, in the war zone, in the hurricanes, the earthquakes, the drought, the famine, is God really there or not? God leads us at times into the scorching, shape-shifting deserts for reasons we don't often understand. And that is when we mostly cry out, where are you, God? It's really the only question that matters. To ask it is to register our need, our yearning, and our hope. To ask it is to journey into radical freedom, knowing that the God of both the wilderness and the water has compassion enough for our questions, our doubts, and our fears.
Amen.
Life is filled with so many senseless events. Mindless tragedies fill our newspapers every day. Airplane crashes, the murder of innocent children, insane terrorism, natural disasters. And much in our own lives seems without purpose or meaning, like a rainstorm on a picnic day, a bad cold when we're having a party, a child that's born with challenges, the early death of a parent or a spouse, a broken marriage, a car that won't start in the morning, the betrayal of friends, the disappointments of life. We are often left to wonder why such things happen. Is there truly any point and purpose behind them? Are we alone in this universe that cares anything about us? Is God with us or not? It is not just those thirsty Israelites who ask that question. It's a question we ask ourselves as well. Remember that the Israelites had just come across the Red Sea, so it's very early in their wanderings, the beginning of their long 40 years. And even though they had memories of the miraculous presence of God who saved them from the plagues and rescues them from Pharaoh's army, they still had forgotten. They have experienced the work of God firsthand in the darkest of circumstances. But still they wanted more evidence. But what they really wanted was personal satisfaction, I believe. I'm hungry, I'm thirsty, I'm lonely, I'm broke, I'm hurt, I'm sick. What are you going to do about that, God? How are you going to fix that? Suddenly we find that wilderness is not just a geographical place. It becomes a state of mind and spirit for anyone who is on this journey of faith. Now, before we say those silly, ungrateful Israelites, we should stop and consider our own individual states of faith. And here's the clincher. Our faith is often about what we want God to do for us. How we want God to conform to our needs, our necessities, in ways that truly make sense to us, and we want it to occur in our timetable. We measure God's faithfulness to us in terms of God's ability to deliver the goods. And God seems faithful when we are getting what we want. Like the Israelites, we don't want to stop long enough to consider what God has already done in the past, or consider the evidence that surrounds us of God's current active presence in our lives and our world. Our concerns are immediate and future-oriented. We want to shove the issue at hand before God. I mean, after all, if God is truly God, then what's my little problem to the one who has made the heavens and the earth? So we bring our desires, our wants, and we say, here's the situation, God. You solve it. And solve it before tomorrow, please. Now, acting like this or believing like this supports our faith as long as results are immediate. But what about those long pauses of silence and stillness when there is no response? What happens when our promotion doesn't come through, or the diagnosis is cancer, or the marriage can't be saved, or the child will never get well, or you are in the wilderness without a water fountain in sight? Then is God among us or not? Those who survive and thrive in suffering are those who see God not as a solution waiting to happen or a quick fix to numb our pain. Instead, they view God as being present in and with our challenges. A powerful movie came out quite a few years ago called Hotel Rwanda. Anybody seen that? Hotel Rwanda? It's a film about the genocide that occurred in the nation of Rwanda. Now, the main character, I can't think of his name right now, I can see him, Who is it?
Forrest Whitaker.
No, he was short, comedian. That's it, Don Cheadle. He's the main character. He's a resort hotel manager named Paul. And he ends up protecting over 1,200 refugees who came to the hotel for sanctuary. Now, throughout the story, Paul never loses hope. On his face, the people around him and even the people watching the movie can observe the determined belief that help is going to come and save them. And even if help never arrives, then there will be a way for Paul to use his resources to constantly provide a cool oasis in the midst of hell. Now, there's no overt references to the faith of Paul and his family, but around his wife's neck is a gold cross on a gold chain. And I believe it was a kind of a symbol, a silent message of the source of their hope and strength. After a long day, Paul went to bed exhausted by the daily bartering and the constant threats of civil war just beyond the hotel gate. And he gathered his family up to sleep in one of the hotel rooms. In the dark and the long, lonely hours of the night, Paul lies in bed, and he begins to allow his mind to face the stark realities of protecting his own family as well as the refugees. Outside of the hotel gates was a horror we could not even begin to imagine as people were slaughtered. And he kept threatening to storm down the gates and come to the scene of the hotel. As his wife lay next to him, Paul reaches over and he rubs the cross around her neck. It's a simple recognition that real faith is not acknowledging an obvious God. Real faith is clinging for dear life to a deeply hidden God in the midst of the darkness of our sometimes cruel world. No matter what happens, God will be here with me. Now, some faith leaders preach and teach that believers were so privileged that we live in the light of God's presence most of the time. God's just going to bless us with everything. There might be a few little ups and downs, but they're very minor. I don't find that to be helpful personally. I think it's great to be positive and to continually speak of God's presence, God's hope, God's grace, God's love that's given to us. But that doesn't mean we're all going to live a pie-in-the-sky existence. Doesn't mean you're going to win the lottery this week. I think our spiritual lives are more characterized by living in darkness that is so rich you can almost taste it. When things are at their worst, you can almost feel the presence of God. Amen. It is a darkness that surrounds and overwhelms and threatens us as much as those Rwandans were surrounded by the chaos and hate of the war outside their gates. But in that darkness, there are moments where we can see a glimpse of God's glory, and it's so bright that it almost blinds our eyes with the light. These glimpses of the glory hint of a deeper joy and peace that represents far more than anything we have yet to know. There are glimpses of grace that shine in the darkness, like fireflies on a summer's night. I think perhaps that this is a story of what God's grace is like. If in our dark wanderings and questions of is God with us or not, if we will but keep our eyes open and anticipation and not shut them in fear and dread, we will experience glimpses of God, moments of joy that will take our breath away and bring tears to our eyes. because faith does not shut its eyes in the darkness. Rather, faith keeps its eyes open and focused, watching for the miracles of grace that punch holes of light and hope into the darkness that may surround us. So today we may ask, is God with us or not? I know what my answer will be. Do you know what your answer will be?
Amen.
Amen. God bless you.